All right, well, it is 4 p.m., so good afternoon and welcome to week number 7 for PPA 500. Tonight is our final Zoom session together, and so this is our last live session that we will be having. And you are just about done with all the assignments in the course. You have done your Canvas essays. Canvas essay number 5 is due today, and so the only assignment that you have left to complete is the final assessment. And so that final assessment will be due next Wednesday by midnight. And so make sure that you do get that wrapped up before midnight next Wednesday. Again, there will be no Zoom session next Wednesday. This is our final one. In terms of that final assessment, we took a look at that final assessment last week, so you should be familiar with the 5 scenarios on that final assessment. As always, be as concise and parsimonious as you can be with your answers. 1 to 2 paragraphs per question will certainly be good enough to get the job done. And I know there's still information on that final assessment that we have not covered. We will cover that information here tonight with our discussion of the management of human resources and the management of financial resources. So those 2 pieces of information that we will cover tonight will then give you all the information that you need in order to do all 5 of those scenarios on the final assessment. So that will be all of our information that we normally cover throughout this course. We'll finish up with tonight. So as you know, the way in which we've kind of progressed through this course is that we are now in the throes of the discussion of the functions of public administration, talking about practically what public administrators tend to do in public organizations on a daily basis. We had talked 2 weeks ago about public organization theory and about the function of leading and managing public organizations. We talked about how that literature evolved and developed and how our viewpoints on public organizations and how they should be studied and how they should be managed changed over that 150-year period of time. So that was our first real function, leading and managing public organizations. And that provided you with some insight into your PPA 660 organization theory course. Then last week, we talked about the functions that public administrators play in terms of the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of public policies and public programs. The discussion last week in the first part of class on public policies provides you with the insight that you need for PPA 670 policy analysis. And then the second half of class last week, when we talked about the role that public administrators play in program evaluation, then gives you the insight that you need for your upcoming PPA 696 research methods course. Tonight, with our discussion of the management of human resources and management of financial resources, you will get the insight you need to go ahead in future courses and take PPA 577 Human Resource Management and PPA 555 Public Budgeting and Finance. So the first half of our night together, we will talk about the management of human resources, and then the second part of class night, we will talk about the management of financial resources. And then that will wrap up all of our information for our semester together. So without further ado, because I know it's a lot of information to cover, and it'll probably take us the lion's share of our time tonight to cover these 2 topics. So let's jump right into it and talk about the management of human resources. Now, we know with our discussion of the differences between public and private sector organizations that one of the primary differences is that in the private sector, employees are what we consider to be at-will employees. So they are hired at the will of the organization. They keep their jobs at the will of the organization. They can be dismissed and terminated at the will of the organization. So at-will employees do not have the same types of protections that public employees do. In the public sector, the vast majority of our public administrators are career civil servants. And so they have these protections against arbitrary and capricious dismissal. They keep their jobs, they get their jobs based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and then they keep their jobs based upon their performance. So it really is a very stark contrast between the employees in the public sector versus the private sector. But let's delve a little bit deeper into this idea of career civil service, where our civil service system came from, and then some of the implications of having a civil service system in the management of human resources in public organizations. So we all read the Woodrow Wilson article from 1887, his study of administration. And we know in that article, he talked a lot about in this politics administration dichotomy that if we can pull administration out of the political world, we could better focus on the what he called business of government. And we focus on that business of government because we're pulling politics out. We can then borrow innovations from other countries, such as England and their system of civil service. And that's exactly what we did. We borrowed the British civil service system and we implemented it here in our system of public employment. The way in which our civil service system operates and looks, obviously different than the way in which it operated and looked in Britain. And we'll get into some of those differences in a second. But the career civil service system that we have today, we did not always have. And pre-Woodrow Wilson, we did not have a career civil service system. If you go back to the founding of the nation, in the late 1700s up until the 1820s, people got their jobs as public administrators, they got their jobs as bureaucrats based upon who they were. And this is what's known as the era of gentlemen. So in the era of gentlemen, people got their jobs in the national bureaucracy and the national government based upon their standing in society. Did they come from the best social family backgrounds? Did they go to the best academic institutions? So what we were doing is we were trying to hire people to work in the national bureaucracy who had this type of gravitas, these gentlemen. And the purpose of that was to try and add legitimacy to this new fledgling government. We'll wake up tomorrow morning and we will fully expect that the national government will still be there. We will expect that Congress will be there. We'll expect the president will be there. We expect the Supreme Court will be there. We expect all these departments and agencies at the federal level will be there as well. It's a much more permanent feel that we have for the national government today than people have for the national government in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. So when people are concerned about the permanency of this new government, you have to add legitimacy to it. And so you add legitimacy to it by hiring these gentlemen, these respected people in society to work in the national government. So in the era of gentlemen from the late 1700s up to the 1820s, we are hiring people based upon who they were. Were they these gentlemen, these respected members of society? Now, if you remember from your American history courses, in 1824, we had a very consequential presidential election. And in the presidential election of 1824, we had multiple candidates running for the presidency. We had John Quincy Adams, we had Andrew Jackson, we had Henry Clay, and other candidates as well. Whenever you have multiple people running for the presidency, it makes it more difficult for any one candidate to get a majority of the vote. And that's what happened in 1824. In the 1824 election, Andrew Jackson got more popular votes than any of the other candidates, and he also got more electoral college votes than any of the other candidates. The problem for Jackson is that because so many people were running, he was unable to get a majority of the electoral college votes. We know from our reading of the Constitution that if no one gets a majority of the electoral college votes, then the presidential election goes into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives will then select the president. The way in which the House does it is that each congressional delegation gets one vote to cast for president, irrespective of the size of that congressional delegation. So today you think about a state like California that has by far the most representatives in the House of Representatives, over 50, 53, I believe it is, representatives in the House of Representatives. Think about a state like Wyoming that has one representative in the House of Representatives. Both of those states, despite that big difference in representation, would get one vote each in the selection of the president. And that's the way the Constitution tells us the Electoral College will work. So no one had a majority in the Electoral College, so the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, and you had a deal that was allegedly made by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Henry Clay was a very powerful person in Congress. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Henry Clay had a lot of support among the House. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams allegedly came to a deal whereby Henry Clay would get his supporters in the House to support John Quincy Adams. And then in exchange, once Adams became president, he would then reward Henry Clay with a cabinet position. And just not any cabinet position, he would reward him with Secretary of State. Well, sure enough, Henry Clay's supporters threw their support behind John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams won the Electoral College because of the House of Representatives selecting him. And so then he becomes president. When he became president, he then appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State. This has gone down in history as known as the corrupt bargain. So the 1824 election was known as the corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. The candidate who was frozen out of that deal was Andrew Jackson, the same person who won more popular votes as well as more electoral votes than any other candidate. Obviously, that did not sit well with Andrew Jackson or his supporters. 4 years later, in the 1828 election, Andrew Jackson runs again for the presidency and wins in a landslide, wins the majority of the popular vote, and also wins a large majority in the Electoral College. So in 1828, Andrew Jackson gets elected as president. When Jackson comes into the White House, because of his background as well as because of his experience with the corrupt bargain in 1824, he had a lot of disdain for elitist thinking. He had a lot of disdain for the quote unquote gentlemen of government. And he really believed that average, ordinary Americans could do the work of government. So instead of staffing the bureaucracy with these gentlemen, he wanted to staff the bureaucracy with his supporters. And so that transitions us from this era of gentlemen into what's known as the era of spoils, sometimes referred to as the era of patronage. The mantra here in the era of spoils is to the victor go the spoils. So the winning political candidate, the winning political party could then dole out government jobs as rewards for people who supported them and helped to get them elected to office. So now you're no longer hiring bureaucrats based upon who they are, you are hiring them based upon who they know. Did they support you? Did they support the winning political party? Well, we know once we start bringing in people who supported the winning party as opposed to people who were from, the most respected educational institutions and things such as that, you're bringing people into the work of government who may not have the requisite skills to do the work of government. The skill set that it takes to get someone elected to office is oftentimes not the same skill set that it takes to effectively govern while in office. So you have people coming in these positions who didn't have the knowledge, skills, and abilities. It led to a lot of inefficiencies because of this quid pro quo of you support me and I will give you a job, led to a lot of corruption, like we saw with George Washington Plunkett and Tammany Hall political machine in New York City that we discussed earlier when we talked about accountability and ethics, brought in a lot of misfeasance and malfeasance. And throughout the 1800s, from the 1820s up until the 1870s, there was kind of this growing discontent about the corrupt nature of government and the inefficiency in the national bureaucracy. We not only had the era of patronage, the era of spoils at the national level, we also had it at the local level as well. And so, as we said before, Tammany Hall, the political machine in New York City. George Washington Plunkett, as part of his memoirs, he wrote about what he felt was the lack of value of a college education. In his memoirs, he gave advice to a young person who wanted to get a job in government. And his advice was, do not go to college and fill your head with all of this quote unquote college rot. Rather than filling your head with college rot, you should go out there and learn how to round up votes for a candidate. That is the best, most effective way of getting a job in government. And that really was how you got jobs in the era of spoils. But at the local level, we really had a lot of this discontent about all the corruption and inefficiencies that were going on in city government. So much so that in a lot of our major cities, we saw the creation of what were called municipal leagues. And all these municipal leagues were organized around trying to reform government, trying to make government work better, to work more efficiently, and to be less corrupt. It was this whole good government type of movement that we oftentimes associate with the old progressive movement back in the 1800s and the early 1900s. So percolating up from the local level, you have all these municipal leagues trying to come up with a way to replace the era of spoils with something more like an era of merit. The gentleman you see on the screen there is Representative Pendleton. And Pendleton authored legislation that would eventually be known as the Pendleton Act that would replace the era of spoils with this era of merit, where we would hire people based upon their merit, their knowledge, skills, and their abilities. The problem for Pendleton is that he wasn't able to get any traction in Congress for his legislation. As we know with the policy formulation process that we talked about last week, usually when we make major changes to our policy approaches, those major changes usually come about because of some type of a triggering event. There's some focusing or triggering event that happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea we need to make a change to how we are addressing this issue. The big triggering event that helped usher in the era of merit was the assassination of President Garfield. So President Garfield was elected in the election of 1880. Soon thereafter, in 1881, he was then assassinated by Charles J. Guiteau. Charles J. Guiteau was a very eccentric kind of guy. He was sometimes in his life a preacher, and other times in his life he was an author, a revolutionary, a party leader, really wore a whole lot of different hats. Guiteau wanted to be famous. That was essentially his primary goal in life, is he wanted to be recognized, he wanted to be famous. And so he thought, this is the era of spoils after all. I have written some campaign speeches for Garfield. And he did. He wrote some campaign speeches and sent them to the Garfield campaign. There is no indication historically whatsoever that Garfield ever used any of those speeches, that Garfield ever read any of those speeches, or even that Garfield even knew who Charles Guiteau was. But Guiteau felt this is an era of spoils, so I helped Garfield get elected, so therefore I should get a plum type of an appointment in the federal government. And the plum appointment that he wanted was to be ambassador to France. But the problem with that is that obviously he was not given the ambassador to France position. He was not given any position by the Garfield administration. So kind of in his warped thought, he thought, if I assassinate James Garfield, Garfield's vice president is Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was a big believer in patronage. He was a big believer in the era of spoils. So I assassinate Garfield, Arthur becomes president, Arthur will then give me my appointment as ambassador to France. So he assassinates Garfield. I believe it was in a Baltimore train station where he did it. Instead of getting his appointment as ambassador to France, he was executed for the assassination of James Garfield. But what happened is this was your galvanizing event that really got people thinking about, we really need to change this era of spoils. It ended up getting a president assassinated. So we really do need to make a change. That was the policy window, as John Kingdon tells us, that opened up for Pendleton. Pendleton then introduced his act into Congress, got it passed through the House and the Senate, signed by the president, and it then became the Pendleton Act, which was signed in 1883. The 1883 Pendleton Act then ushers in this era of merit. Now we are going to hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. How are we going to know whether or not they have those knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job? We will give them an examination. So we create this series of examinations that people will take to demonstrate that they have the skills to do the job that they have applied for. As we know from our reading of Woodrow Wilson's article, these examinations were not something brand new. Britain had been using those examinations in their civil service system for many years. We adopted that system of examinations and we made it an open system of examinations. So anyone who was interested in applying for that job had the ability to sit for that examination. So now we're saying we're hiring people based upon their merit, their knowledge, skills, and their abilities. And not only are we hiring them based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, but they are retaining their jobs based upon their performance as opposed to politics. So we start to protect these federal employees from political influence. So this person cannot be removed from their job just because they belong to a different party than their supervisor, or because they support a different candidate than their supervisor does. So we made it performance instead of political in terms of these determinations about whether or not someone could keep their job in the national government. So this era of merit really does come in with the Pendleton Act in 1883. Now, subsequent to 1883, we see Congress every few years pass piecemeal legislation that will amend the Pendleton Act, and they kind of add on more regulations here and there, and the regulations start adding up. The problem that we also recognize is that in the Pendleton Act, we were protecting public administrators from political influence, but we were not precluding them from engaging in political activities. So we had people who were using their public office to campaign for candidates and for parties. They were using the resources of their office to campaign for candidates and parties. They were using their public time that they were supposed to be spending working on public business to campaign. So we realized that if we're going to protect them from political influence, we are also going to demand that they do not engage in political activity while on the job. And that's what then led to the adoption of the Hatch Act. So in 1939, we get the adoption of this Hatch Act that says that public administrators are not allowed to use their public office for political types of activities. Now, once you are off public time and once you're at home, as long as you're not using public resources, you're not using your public office, then you can support and campaign for whatever candidate and party you want to on your private time. You just cannot do it using your public office or public resources. That Hatch Act at the federal level then spawned a lot of what we call little Hatch Acts. And all the different states started to adopt their own little Hatch Acts to limit the political activity of state employees. Here in California, our current version of that Hatch Act is the Political Reform Act of 1974. And the Political Reform Act places the Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC, in charge of monitoring these types of political activities when they do occur, and then deciding whether or not someone is crossing that line between politics and administration by campaigning for a candidate on the public's dime. So every state now kind of has that same type of limitation that we saw at the federal level with the adoption of this Hatch Act. Then let's fast forward to the 1970s. When we get to 1978, we are now almost 100 years removed from the adoption of the Pendleton Act and the beginning of this era of merit and the creation of this career civil service system. Along the way, Congress has continued to pass all this piecemeal legislation, adding additional regulations onto the original Pendleton Act, so much so that a lot of administrators didn't know what they were allowed to do and what they were not allowed to do. There's a lot of confusion and a lot of fear among administrators because they were not clear on what they were allowed to do as a public activity versus what they could do as a political activity. So we realized we really needed to kind of streamline our civil service system and clarify it for our administrators. So the vehicle we used for that was the passage of the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. The Civil Service Reform Act in 1978 was a whole-scale change to the career civil service system. It created 5 different entities that were all designed to try and make it easier for us to adhere to these merit types of principles. And we're going to go through all five of those entities, and I'll tell you what they are, what they did then, and what they do today. So the first one there is OPM. OPM is the Office of Personnel Management. The Office of Personnel Management was created to be the central clearinghouse for the recruitment and hiring process in the federal bureaucracy. So whenever agencies have a vacancy that they need to fill, they would need to go through the Office of Personnel Management. The Office of Personnel Management would then create the job announcement with the minimum and preferred qualifications for that job. They would then solicit those applications from applicants. They would create the examination that would then be used that these applicants would sit for in order to demonstrate they had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. OPM would administer the examinations. They would score the examinations. Then upon scoring the examinations, OPM would then create an eligibility list, usually an eligibility list of the top 3 or the top 5 scorers on that examination. It's usually what's referred to as a rule of 3 or a rule of 5. Those top 3 or those top 5 candidates that were placed upon that eligibility list, when the agency wanted to then conduct interviews, it could only interview people off of that eligibility list because those were your top scorers on this examination. So ostensibly, those are the people who had the highest knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to do the job. So as you can see, it was a very centralized hiring process, and all that was centralized through the Office of Personnel Management. Then the second organization that was created is the MSPB, which is the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board. So the question that had emerged before the Civil Service Reform Act was, if you were a federal employee and you felt that your merit principles were being violated, you were being sanctioned, demoted, disciplined in some manner for reasons other than your performance. So you belong to a different political party and your supervisor didn't like it. And so your supervisor was demoting you or making it impossible for you to seek a promotion and was doing it for those types of political reasons. That would be a direct violation of your merit protections. You could then take your claim to the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board, as a quasi-investigatory body, would then investigate your claim to see how credible your claim was. They would go and do a full-blown investigation. And then based upon the results of their investigation, they would then render a decision as to whether or not your merit principles have been violated. They also could then issue corrective action. So if you had been demoted and they come in and they say, based on our investigation, you should not have been demoted, you were demoted for reasons other than merit principles, then they would restore you to your original position and could also provide you with back pay with interest for the lost pay that occurred because of your demotion. They could also issue sanctions against leaders as well as the organization itself if it was violating merit principles. So if you as an individual felt your merit protections were violated, you would take your case to this Merit System Protection Board. And the Merit System Protection Board, just like the Office of Personnel Management, they are still with us today. So they're still part of our current career civil service system. Well, a couple of weeks ago, when we talked about accountability and ethics, we talked about whistleblowing. And we said, well, what happens if someone in an agency sees merit principles being violated for other people, is they're not having their own merit principles violated, but they see violations going on in their organization, and they blow the whistle on those violations. Those whistleblowers would then take their claim to this third organization known as the Office of Special Counsel. And the Office of Special Counsel was again a quasi-investigatory body. So they would go out there and they would conduct an investigation of your whistleblower claim. If they determine that your whistleblower claim is credible, then they could come in and offer corrective actions. They could protect you from retaliation. They could sanction agencies for retaliating against you. They could provide you with monetary compensation to make you whole as a result of that retaliation. So they had a lot of corrective actions that they could take to try and protect whistleblowers from retaliation. The problem with the Office of Special Counsel is when it was created in the Civil Service Reform Act, it was created as part of the Merit Systems Protection Board. So it was subsumed within the organization of the Merit System Protection Board. What that meant is the Office of Special Counsel lacked its own independent budget and lacked its own independent staff. So the Office of Special Counsel, very quickly after it was created, had a massive backlog of cases, a massive backlog of claims from whistleblowers. And it didn't have the staff or the money to take care of that backlog. So in this Whistleblower Protection Act that we had talked about a few weeks ago, the Whistleblower Protection Act pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit System Protection Board, made the Office of Special Counsel its own independent organization with its own staffing and its own budget so that it could better deal with all of these whistleblower claims. So today, the Office of Special Counsel is its own independent body. So just to recap quickly, if it was your merit principles being violated, you would go to the Merit System Protection Board. If you were a whistleblower, then you would go to the Office of Special Counsel. So we're kind of trying to lay out very clearly for employees the path they would need to take if they felt their merit principles were being violated to help protect those merit principles. This fourth organization that was created, the FLRA, that stands for the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority was given the auspices over the collective bargaining process at the federal level. So whenever employee unions collectively bargain and negotiate with management, those negotiations are then under the oversight of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So what may happen in this negotiation process is when the two parties come together at the table, you may see what are called unfair labor practices. So for instance, you may have the employee union put forth their first offer, and their initial bargaining offer may be for a 5% salary raise. Then management may counter that with, well, we're going to counter with a 3% raise. Then the union comes back and says, well, let's split the difference at 4%. Management says, no, we're going to actually back it down to 2%. You can't do that. That's what's known as regressive bargaining. You can't initially offer 3% and then a follow-up offer of 2%. Your follow-up subsequent offers always must be more attractive than your initial offer. So that could be considered to be an unfair labor practice. Consider another hypothetical situation where you have employees in an organization and these employees want to form a union. So they want to get together and form a bargaining unit. The agency tries to stop that, and they try to bust up the union. And they say, well, if you join this bargaining unit, then we are going to fire you, or we are going to reduce the number of your hours, or whatever the case may be. That would also then be considered to be an unfair labor practice, and the union could then take their case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Now, the problem for the Federal Labor Relations Authority is it was created in 1978, but very early on, it had a very high-profile case that it had to deal with. And that high-profile case was the striking of federal air traffic controllers. So the Federal Air Traffic Controllers Union decided that they could not come to an agreement with management over a new contract, so they then threatened to go on strike. President Reagan, who was a new president, he had just been inaugurated less than a year earlier, President Reagan said, if you go on strike, I am going to fire you and I will replace you with new air traffic controllers. So all air traffic controllers that go on strike, we are going to fire you. Air traffic controllers said, you can't do that, so we are going on strike. Those air traffic controllers who went on strike were then summarily fired by the Reagan administration. They then brought their case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority saying, firing us was an unfair labor practice. We have the opportunity to organize and go on strike if we want to. Firing us is an unfair labor practice. The Federal Labor Relations Authority sided with the Reagan administration. It said that this is an exception to the rule, in that these positions have a direct impact upon public safety. And so the impact on public safety outweighs the right of these employees to go on strike. The problem for that was then a PR problem for the FLRA. Subsequent to that, a lot of federal employee unions felt that the Federal Labor Relations Authority was biased toward administration as opposed to supporting unions. And whether fair or unfair, that was the perception that a lot of employee unions had about the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Now, the Federal Labor Relations Authority has auspices over collective bargaining for the vast majority of federal employee unions. The major exception to that is the Postal Workers Union. The Postal Workers Union is under the control of the National Labor Relations Board. So essentially, you have a National Labor Relations Board that oversees collective bargaining in the private sector. And then you have a Federal Labor Relations Authority that oversees collective bargaining in the public sector. Well, since the U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation, it kind of looks and acts and feels more like a private corporation. And so that's why the Postal Workers Union is under the oversight of the NLRB as opposed to being under the oversight of the FLRA. Now, here in California, we have a corollary organization to the FLRA, and that is what's called CalPERB, P-E-R-B. CalPERB is the Employee Relations Board, the Public Employee Relations Board, and that's what CalPERB stands for. CalPERB has oversight over the collective bargaining process for state and local employees. So if you are a local employee and you are trying to organize into a union and your agency tries to quash that, then you can always declare that as an unfair labor practice and then go to CalPERB with your case. CalPERB will then adjudicate your case in a similar way in which FLRA would adjudicate a case at the national level of government. So here in California, we call ours CalPERB. Then your fifth organization that was created is what's called the Senior Executive Service, or the SES. And this takes a little bit of explaining to explain what the SES is and why the SES was created. When you think about our contemporary period of civil service, the vast majority of our employees are career civil servants. They all work in classified positions that are a part at the federal level of what's known as the general schedule. So we have a position classification system at the federal level called the general schedule. Every position then has a GS level to it, a general schedule level to it. And those are called the grade levels. So technically today, the career civil service, the general schedule runs from a GS1 up to a GS15 position. Now, before the Civil Service Reform Act and before the creation of the Senior Executive Service, it ran from GS1 up to GS18. The problem that we had recognized is that even though 99.99% of our public administrators at the federal level were career civil servants, our agencies and departments were still headed up by political appointees. So your secretaries of departments and your deputy secretaries of departments, your directors of federal agencies, your commissioners in your federal regulatory commissions, these are individuals who are appointed by the president and in most instances confirmed by the Senate. Now, whether or not their Senate confirmation will depend upon the actual position that's being appointed, but many of them are also subject to Senate confirmation. So these are political appointees. As a political appointee, you are put in this position to further the policy interests of the president. So you are the one who's running the organization, the very top level. But then the vast majority of the rest of the organization will be career civil servants. But the problem with that is that these political appointees are not there for a very long period of time. The average tenure for a political appointee in the federal level is about 18 to 24 months in a given organization. That's a short period of time. However, for these career civil servants, they're in their positions for 20, 30, perhaps even up to 40 years. So they are there for a lifetime. So if the career civil servants don't like what that political appointee wants them to do, they will just ignore it. And they'll say, well, you'll be gone in 18 to 24 months. I'm going to be here permanently, so I'll just wait you out. Eventually, you're going to be gone. Eventually, there'll be an intervening election, and probably another political party will be elected. And maybe that political appointee will be more in line with what I want to see the department do and the direction I want to see the organization go. So you had this chasm between your political appointees at the top and then your vast majority of career civil servants. So what the senior executive service was meant to do is to take the top three levels of the general schedule, GS 16, 17, and 18 employees, those very top supervisory positions, pull them out of the career civil service and put them into this new senior executive service. When people would join the senior executive service, they had a trade-off in that the inducement to join was that Congress promised to provide them with bonus pay, kind of a pay for performance. So if your organization started performing better and started achieving its goals and objectives, you would be rewarded with this bonus pay. It also provided an incentive that you could move laterally between organizations much easier. And so if you were at this, one of these top supervisory positions at the Department of Education, you decided you wanted to go to the Department of Labor, that was a very quick and very easy lateral type of transition that you could do, that before the senior executive service, it would have been more difficult to make that transition. But what you have to give up in exchange for joining the senior executive service is you have to give up your career civil service protections. So it becomes easier to fire and to sanction and discipline members of the senior executive service as opposed to career civil servants. So it kind of created a kind of this netherworld between the political appointees and the career civil servants, created the senior executive service to try and fill that gap. The problem was that for these members of the senior executive service, Congress did not make good on its promise for bonus pay. When time came to authorize that bonus pay, Congress would say, we have empty pockets. We are running a deficit. Expenditures are exceeding our revenues by billions of dollars. We don't have the money to provide bonus pay to senior executive servants. So those SESers ended up losing out on a lot of those promises that Congress had initially made to them. But what it does is it creates this current civil service classification system that we have at the federal level. So at the very top, we have non-civil servants, these political appointees. Then below that, we have, again, non-civil servants, the senior executive service members. And today, the senior executive service is made up of 5 levels. They're ES1 through ES5. So executive service 1 through executive service 5 positions. Then below that, you then have your career civil servants running from a GS15 down to, at least in theory, a GS1. Now, there really aren't many, if any, GS1 positions. Usually about as low as they're going to go when we hire somebody to work in the federal government is going to be a GS3. A GS3 level will typically be a student intern, a student job. Those are usually what we consider to be GS3 positions. Above that, GS5 to GS7, those tend to be your entry-level positions. So very first job in the federal bureaucracy would put somebody at the GS5 to GS7 if they didn't have other experience or other education or training. GS8 to GS12 are going to be your mid-level types of positions, and then GS13 to GS15 are now your top-level supervisory positions in the general schedule. Positions above GS15 are going to be ES1 to ES5. That's what we call our senior executive service. Now, if you were going to enter into the career civil service at the federal level with a master's degree, an MPA degree, with no experience, you would probably go in around a GS11-ish type of position with an MPA. If you had other relevant experience, that might be able to boot you up to maybe a GS12 type of position. But that's about the point that you would go in with a graduate level type of degree. So that's our modern system of civil service. The advantages of this system of civil service is that we are protecting those employees from political interference. So they get their jobs based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and they keep the jobs based upon their performance. Therefore, we're hiring people who have the requirements to do the job well, and then they keep their jobs because they are doing their job well. The disadvantages associated with career civil service is it adds a lot of complexity to our job of trying to manage human resources. You've got a lot of these civil service types of protections that you have to be aware of as you are managing your personnel and your organization. Also, it becomes much more difficult in a career civil service system to discipline and terminate an employee. Now, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, it is not impossible to terminate a career civil servant. It is just far more difficult to do that with a career civil servant than it would be with an at-will type of employee. So that's our modern system of civil service. So it adds on a lot of regulations that we need to be aware of as we are managing our human resources. Then overlay on top of all those civil service regulations, limitations and rules that come to us in the form of collective bargaining agreements. We have mentioned more than once in this class that public employees tend to be unionized at about 3 times the level of private sector employees. So we have a lot of these public employee unions in the public sector. These public employee unions will engage in a collective bargaining negotiation process with management to try and arrive at a collective bargaining agreement, otherwise known as a contract. Those contracts will then have a lot of stipulations in them about how people are hired, how people get access to professional development, how people's performance are evaluated, how frequently, and the method of evaluation that's used. Whenever sanctioning and discipline is necessary, how that sanctioning and discipline will be carried out, grievances that can be filed by those employees, and if there's any termination, when and how and why termination can occur. All that is going to be spelled out in that contract. Contracts tend to be very lengthy and very legalistic. Some contracts will have upwards of 40 different articles to them. So they'll be longer than the federal Constitution. So there are a lot of details in those contracts that we have to be mindful of above and beyond those career civil service protections that we also need to adhere to as well. Now, this collective bargaining process is the process by which this collective bargaining agreement is arrived at between the bargaining unit and our representatives from the agency. The types of issues that can be collectively bargained over will depend, my favorite answer, it depends. It depends upon the level of government that you are talking about. So to a lot of people's surprise, the issue of compensation, salary increases, is not within the permissive scope of bargaining at the federal level. So in terms of a scope of bargaining, when we say scope of bargaining, we're talking about the types of issues that can be negotiated in the collective bargaining process. So compensation is outside of that permissive scope of bargaining at the national level. The reason why is because Congress establishes the compensation for federal employees. So since it's Congress's role, you cannot have a collective bargaining process that would supersede what Congress is telling us about compensation. The way the process works is there is a compensation commission that is established, and Congress can appoint people to it. The president can also appoint people to it. Back in the Obama administration, one of my colleagues from BYU was appointed by President Obama to the Compensation Commission. And this commission would then meet a couple of times per year. They would review inflationary data, possible cost of living adjustments, and then determine what types of recommendations to make to Congress in terms of increases in compensation for federal employees. Now, whether or not Congress wanted to accept those recommendations, that was completely up to Congress. And a lot of those recommendations made by the commission are not accepted by Congress. But Congress establishes compensation, so you cannot collectively bargain over it. Now, that sounds really weird to us at the state and local level because probably the number one issue that is subject to collective bargaining at the state and local level tends to be compensation. And so at the state and local level, compensation is certainly usually within that permissive scope of bargaining. So you can have permissive scopes of bargaining where you allow a lot of issues to be collectively bargained over, or you could have restrictive scopes of bargaining, like we see in a lot of southern states. And so if you would compare the scope of bargaining in California, which is relatively permissive, to the scope of bargaining in Alabama, you're going to find that there are far fewer issues that can be collectively bargained over in the state of Alabama than can be bargained over in the state of California. Well, this collective bargaining process, these negotiations can be very time intensive. They can be very difficult. They can be very contentious. And it could take us a lot of work and a lot of time to arrive at an agreement on that contract. When we are unable to come to an agreement in the collective bargaining process, either party can then declare what's called an impasse. And an impasse is basically where one or maybe even both of the parties will throw their hands up and say, we cannot come to an agreement. We are at an impasse. Once you are at that impasse, then you open up some resolution options that you can use to try and break that impasse. Now, usually the collective bargaining rules in the state will require that before a union goes on strike, that union must declare an impasse. So you can't just go on strike. You have to first say, we're at an impasse before you can then be authorized to take a strike vote. We saw that here with the California Faculty Association, the California Faculty Union in the past year. They came to an impasse with the Cal State system, and they had to declare that impasse first and then try some impasse resolution options before they would then be allowed to authorize and go on strike. So those resolution options that you have are basically threefold. The first impasse resolution option that you have is what's called fact finding. Fact finding is a relatively simple process where you will identify an independent third party, a fact finder, who will then come in and look at all the negotiations that have happened. And they will collect the facts, collect the information about all the different offers that have been made by both sides and how that negotiation process has proceeded. They will then take all that information and write up a neutral fact finder report, where they will just, in their fact finding report, just basically say, here is what happened. The fact finder report is non-binding, so it doesn't bind either party to follow that report. There usually are not recommendations in that report. It usually is just a very benign, neutral, this is what happened in the negotiations process. That fact finding report, once it is created by the fact finder, will then be embargoed for 2 weeks, meaning that only the union and management are able to see what's in that fact finder report for a 2-week period of time. The reason why we do that is it allows 2 weeks for both sides to review that report, and then hopefully that report will then spur one of the two sides to make some concessions to come to an agreement before that fact finder report goes public after 2 weeks. Chances are that fact finder report is going to make one of the two parties not look so great. And so if you're management and you don't come off very great in that fact finding report, you're probably going to have an incentive to come to an agreement before the public finds out what's in that fact finder report. And so it's just kind of to try and put a little bit of pressure on the parties to come to an agreement in that 2-week period of time. We saw that happen here at the California Faculty Association. They had a fact finder report. Once that fact finder report was done, both parties kind of still dragged their heels a little bit. And so then the faculty union authorized a strike. I believe it was on the very first day of that authorized teach out, or however they were going to do it. That's when the Cal State system came back and came to an agreement with the California Faculty Union. So I think it was much more the threat of the strike as opposed to a fact-finding report that really got the job done. Mediation is the second approach. In mediation, you will again bring in a neutral third party, a trained federal mediator. That mediator will come in, sit down with the two parties, and see if they can work out a negotiated settlement. Usually mediation is non-binding. It's just trying to get the negotiation going and see if you can get the two sides to come to an agreement. There is an organization at the federal level called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the FMCS, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And that Federal Mediation Conciliation Service has a list of trained federal mediators that it will send out to these contentious bargaining situations to try and mediate the disagreements between the two parties. Uh, when I was in college, one of my political science professors was a federal mediator employed with the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service on contract with them. And so we rarely had class because he was flying all over the country trying to do this mediation in different states all over the US. So they're very busy because there are a lot of very contentious collective bargaining situations. If you really absolutely need to come to a resolution and you need to be guaranteed that you are going to have a resolution to this collective bargaining process, then an approach that you can use is a type of arbitration known as final offer binding arbitration. I'll put that in text chat. Final offer binding arbitration. This is where you'll have a trained arbiter who will come in, and that trained arbiter will say, union, let me see your final proposal. Management, let me see your final proposal. We'll weigh those two proposals and we'll then select one. And that selected offer that is selected by the arbiter then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. It's a very high risk strategy because you've got kind of a 50-50 chance that your offer is the one that's going to be accepted by the arbiter. But it will ensure that you will have a collective bargaining agreement because it is binding. So that final offer selected by the arbiter then becomes that collective bargaining agreement. Again, the important thing here with unionization, you'll talk a lot more about unionization in your PPA 577 course, but the important thing here is we have all of these stipulations that are spelled out in the collective bargaining agreement that will have direct implications on how we manage our human resources. And all of those stipulations are then overlaid on top of the normal career civil service protections that those employees already have. So it makes for a very complex type of situation. It makes the situation so complex that a lot of agencies have decided to centralize the human resource management function within offices of human resources. The idea here is that those offices of human resources are going to be staffed by HR professionals. They are going to know what all these stipulations are in civil service regulations as well as the collective bargaining agreement and know those specifics much better than a line manager may know them. And so it's caused this centralization within offices of HR. The good thing for MPA students is if you're interested in human resource management and you get your, if you're interested in that, you might get your certificate in employee-employer relations. And then there's a lot of positions that are available in public organizations in their HR offices doing these functions of human resource management. Speaking of which, what are these functions of human resource management? So what specifically do we do in carrying out this function of managing our human resources in public organizations? Well, the first function, the first step essentially is recruitment. We obviously have to get staff into our organization before we can manage those staff. We know that there are major differences in recruitment strategies between public and private sector organizations. If you've ever gotten a job in the private sector, you know it's very quick and relatively easy. You can go in for an interview and get the job the same day, and if they can get you on payroll that day, you can start working and getting paid that very day. It's a very quick process. Recruitment in the public sector is much more protracted. If you're working in a public organization, it may have taken you 3 months or 6 months or 9 months to get your job because we have different values in the public sector. Yes, we are concerned with efficiency and effectiveness, just like in the private sector. But we also have our additional public administration values, things like social equity and social justice, creating a representative bureaucracy, protecting the individual rights of citizens we deal with. And so all of those additional values mean that we want to take a more targeted approach to how we recruit people to work in public organizations. We hope by taking a targeted approach, we can do outreach to members of underrepresented populations so that we can reach them, tell them about the organizations, tell them about these jobs, get them to apply for these jobs, hopefully be able to hire them so we can create a much more diverse workforce than perhaps we currently have. That's something we've been working very hard on here in the Graduate Center for Public Policy Administration. We know that we are fortunate to have one of the most diverse student populations of any MPA program in the entire country. But we also recognize that it has been a long process in trying to diversify our faculty to try and match that very diverse student population. And so we do a lot of this targeted recruitment to try and make as diverse hires as we possibly can. And when I was chair, we did 2 tenure track faculty hires. Both of those hires, I'm happy to say, diversified our faculty and helped us move a little bit more in that direction, but there's still a heck of a lot of work to go. And I know Dr. Butts is chair. Every time that he's going to get a chance to hire, that's going to be the number one thing he's going to focus on, is trying to diversify our faculty. But you can do this diversification through targeted recruitment. And so to give you an example, whenever we went out, we'd hire faculty members, we would do targeted recruitment, and we would target our recruitment to different employment sources, such as, I've got listed on the screen for you, the local government Hispanic network. And so we would advertise with that network. We would advertise with the American Society for Public Administration section for women in public administration. Another organization that we work very closely with in the past is the National Forum for Black Public Administrators, again, for this whole purpose of trying to get the most diverse applicant pool that we can possibly get. So we use targeted recruitment. We also work very closely with the Office of Equity and Diversity. So when we go out there to hire, when we put together the vacancy announcement to say, here is the position that's available, here are the minimum qualifications and the preferred qualifications for this position, that vacancy announcement must be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Then we have to put together a recruitment strategy where we say how we're going to do our targeted recruitment, what sources we are going to advertise in. That recruitment plan also needs to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Once you get that approval, you can then go out there and advertise the position. Once you then receive your applications and you have your initial applicant pool, that initial applicant pool then gets passed by Equity and Diversity again to make sure there is adequate diversity in that initial applicant pool. Then you will screen that initial applicant pool using the qualifications that have been approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. You'll then create a list of semifinalists. Usually we like to do about 6 to 10 semifinalists that we will then invite for Zoom or phone interviews, just to kind of try and keep the costs down a little bit. The interview schedule that we use, the questions we use, are also approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity in that recruitment plan that had been approved previously. Once we have that semifinalist pool, that has to be approved by Office of Equity and Diversity. Then we narrow it down to our 3 finalists for on-campus interviews. That finalist pool gets approved by Office of Equity and Diversity. Then our final hire is approved by not only the dean, the provost, but also by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So from the moment in time when we advertise a position, which is usually in late July, to the time in which we extend an offer to a candidate, that's usually going to be early March. So you're looking at multiple months, about half a year there at least, more than half a year that you have gone through, going through this very targeted type of recruitment process. So it does take us a lot longer. It does. The downside of that means that we can lose some candidates. And I know in the past we've lost some candidates to USC, for instance. Not only does USC tend to pay more and have a lighter teaching load, but they oftentimes hire much quicker. Because they don't always have the same types of recruitment requirements that we have in the Cal State system. But those recruitment requirements are there for a reason, and for a very good reason. That's to try and create the most diverse workforce that we can possibly create. So the recruitment process is certainly much different between the public and private sectors. The selection process. So once we are ready to select that candidate from our applicant pool, here in the public sector, we are merit-based, so therefore we select people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. As we said in the past, we use a lot of examinations. So after the passage of the Pendleton Act, The way you got a job in the federal bureaucracy, you had to sit for, take, and pass and get a certain score on an examination. Subsequent to the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act, we have found that we have become more holistic in the way in which we hire people. And one of the primary reasons we have become more holistic is because all the flaws that are associated with the examination process. We know that examinations can lack validity. The goal is that we'll have an examination where performance on the examination will strongly correlate with performance once hired onto the job. So we would hope that that examination, the content of that examination, matches the content of the job. There's a very famous Supreme Court case called Griggs versus Duke Power Company back in the 1970s that established this idea of content validity. And it said just that the content of the exam must match the content of the job. Because we had a situation where, say, for instance, you were hiring for a custodial position, but your examination had calculus on it. Well, do you really need calculus for a custodial position? Probably not. It doesn't really match the content of that custodial position. So content validity means the exam must match the content of the job. We oftentimes try to test the validity of our examinations by using different types of strategies. One strategy we can use is what's called predictive validation. And in predictive validation, what we will do is we will have people take the examination, and then the people who score well on the examination should then, once they're hired in the job, also perform very well on the job. But if you want to do this the correct way, you got to have kind of your experiment on your control group. And so you would then take people who did not perform well on the job, put them in the organization on a probationary basis, and then you would think that if they didn't perform well on the exam, they will not perform well on the job. So you're looking at the correlation between performance on the exam and how well that then predicts performance on the job. That's what's called predictive validation. The opposite of predictive validation is what's called concurrent validation. And in concurrent validation, you would take existing employees and you would take your highest performing employees and you would administer a job exam to them. You would take your lowest performing employees and administer an examination to them. High performing employees should perform well on the exam. Low performing employees should perform poorly on the exam. That's what's called a concurrent validation type of method. But no matter how hard we work in trying to make our exams as valid as possible, we also have to recognize that there's oftentimes a lot of cultural bias in our examinations. And there was so much cultural bias in federal examinations, what was called the old PACE examinations, that the federal government has moved away from the use of those PACE examinations and has moved much more toward this holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities, looking at resumes, looking at experience, looking at education, looking at them from a much more holistic type of perspective. It's kind of similar to what we do in terms of admitting students into our MPA program. We don't rely upon the graduate records examination because we have found the GRE lacks some validity. It lacks a lot of predictive validity, and that sometimes in the past when we've used it, we have people who score off the chart on the GRE and then perform poorly in the program, and vice versa. And we also know that there's a lot of documented cultural bias on the GRE as well. So instead of using exams, we look at your experience, we look at your academic preparation, we look at your statement of purpose, and we do that more holistic type of review in order to admit people to the program. And that provides us with a lot more accurate, if you will, prediction of how well people are going to perform once they are getting their MPAs. An approach that some organizations like to use in selection is the use of an assessment center. Assessment centers are the creation of a simulated work environment. And so perhaps on like a Saturday morning, you would bring in your semifinalists into the simulated work environment, and you would have them do the type of work that they're going to do on a daily basis if they are hired into the job. The problem with that is that they're costly to do these assessment centers. They eat up resources, and we have the Hawthorne effect. As we know from our studies of Elton Mayo and his Hawthorne experiments, one of the reasons why those employees perform better in the Hawthorne electrical plant is because they were being paid attention to, they were being watched. That's the Hawthorne effect. People behave differently when they're being watched as opposed to when they're not being watched. So people will perform really well in the assessment center, but then once they get on the job, they don't perform quite as well. So we really kind of stick more to this holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities in selecting our public administrators. Once we have selected the employee, then our next function is allocation and evaluation. We need to allocate the work among our different positions, and then we need to evaluate that work as well. In order to do allocation and evaluation, we need to know what each one of our positions entails. And so one of the first things that we're going to do is a job analysis. A job analysis is when we will take each position in our organization and we will deconstruct each position into its component elements. So, for example, you may have a position such as a receptionist, someone who is at the front desk in the lobby of this public organization. So the job of that receptionist could be to greet visitors as they enter the door, could be to answer phones, could be to write correspondence, and could be to refer people to the appropriate office, refer visitors to the appropriate office. So those are 4 different functions of that position. Then we're going to look at, well, how much time is spent on each one of those functions. So maybe greeting visitors is going to be 10% of the job. Maybe referring people will be 10% of the job. Maybe answering phones will be 40% of the job, and so on and so on. That will be a job analysis that we'll do for each one of our positions. So we know exactly what goes on in each one of those positions. But in job analysis, we're looking at each position, each job individually to find out what's going on in each one of those jobs. Once we have conducted a job analysis for each one of our positions in our organization, we will then do what's called a job evaluation. In job evaluation, we'll take the results from each of these job analyses and we will then compare them to each other. So let's use the example of looking at a police chief position compared to a patrol officer. So in that police chief position, we know that in our job analysis of that position, we have discovered that the police chief manages a budget. The police chief has supervisory responsibility over the entire police department. That police chief has the responsibility for interacting with external stakeholders, and so on and so on. So those are all the different factors of that job. And we'll then say, well, what's the percentage of time spent on all those different factors? Then we'll look at a patrol officer position. Well, that patrol officer position, something like managing a budget, they may not do. And so they don't spend any time doing that. Supervisory responsibilities, instead of supervising your entire police department, the only supervisory responsibility they may have is maybe supervising rookie officers or something like that. So it's a much lower supervisory type of responsibility. However, there could be another feature of that patrol officer job that differs from the police chief, and that could be something like threat of physical harm. If you're a patrol officer and you're out there patrolling the streets every day, there is a very high risk of physical harm. If you're the police chief and you're not out there patrolling every day, then there's a relatively low risk of physical harm. But we'll compare our positions based upon those different, what we call factors. Each of those factors will be weighted according to importance. So we'll think about how important is risk of physical harm as compared to supervisory responsibility. Well, maybe supervisory responsibility is 2 times as important as risk of physical harm. So we'll weight each one of those factors. Then for each one of those weighted factors, we will then provide a score based upon how each of those positions score on those factors. So for risk of physical harm, the patrol officer position will score very high, maybe 10 out of 10 points on that factor. For the police chief, risk of physical harm, they'll score very low. So maybe they'll score a 2 out of 10. For supervisory responsibilities, the police chief may score 10 out of 10. The patrol officer scores 3 out of 10. So we take the score, we multiply it times the weight for that factor, and then we add up all those summative scores, and then the highest scored positions then get placed at the highest part of our position classification system and then get compensated accordingly. That type of job evaluation I've described to you is what's known as a point factor job evaluation. It is by far still the most common type of job evaluation that is used, a point factor job evaluation. It's used very commonly because it's a relatively simple way to compare our jobs. But again, the purpose of comparing these jobs in a job evaluation is for placing those positions on our position classification system and then assigning equitable compensation. So the police chief, because it's up here on the position classification system, will have a much higher compensation than the patrol officer that will be down here on our position classification system. All career civil service systems are predicated upon this idea of a position classification system. You really can't get the position classification until you have done job analysis and job evaluation. So we use the results of our job analysis and our job evaluation to create position classification systems and assign compensation, but we also use the results of job analysis for the purpose of writing position descriptions. Now, if you're working at a public organization, I am relatively sure that you probably have a position description. That position description, based upon your job analysis, will then list out here are the functions that you do on a daily basis, the tasks you do, and the percentage of time that you spend on each one of those tasks. That is what we consider to be a traditional position description. A lot of organizations recently have moved toward what we call results-oriented descriptions, or RODs. In a results-oriented description, we are going to incorporate performance expectations into that description. So let's go back to our example of the receptionist. So for that receptionist, we said that receptionists, they are greeting visitors, they are answering phone calls, they are typing correspondence, they are referring visitors to appropriate offices. So we said those are the 4 different types of tasks that they do on a daily basis, and then the percentage of time allotted for each one of those tasks. In a results-oriented description, we will then, for each of those tasks, then list the performance expectations. So for greeting visitors, it may be greet 100% of visitors upon entering the building. That's the performance expectation. In terms of answering phone calls, that every phone call gets answered by the second ring and will be answered using the provided script. That's the performance expectation. So if phones are ringing 3 or 4 or 5 times, then obviously you're not meeting that performance expectation. In terms of referring people to offices, that people are referred to the appropriate office 100% of the time. But by incorporating those performance expectations into a results-oriented description, what we are then doing is paving the way for our next function, which is performance evaluation. Now, we'd already talked about job evaluation. That's different than performance evaluation. Job evaluation is comparing jobs to each other for the purpose of classification and compensation. But we're looking at the content of the jobs and how they compare. Performance evaluation, we are obviously evaluating the performance of the incumbent in that job. Now, there are a lot of ways you can do performance evaluation. The problem with performance evaluation is that both the employees as well as the employers oftentimes are hesitant to engage in performance evaluation. For employees, they're hesitant to engage in it because of the risk of what we call cognitive dissonance. All employees feel that they are doing a good job, that they are performing well. And there's always the fear then that you'll get a performance evaluation that tells you something otherwise. If you get a negative evaluation, but you think you're performing well, that creates this cognitive dissonance that is difficult for employees to sometimes handle. From the employer perspective, doing performance evaluations, that's very high stakes in that the outcomes from these performance evaluations can have detrimental impacts upon that employee. If they get negative performance evaluations, perhaps they'll no longer be eligible for a promotion. Perhaps they'll no longer be eligible for attending a training academy or something like that. So you have resistance on both both parties, in order to try and get these performance evaluations done. There was a very good article written many years ago by an author named Charles Fox. And Fox talked about performance evaluations as being what he called the keystone of the human resource process. So he said, if you think about an arch that's made up of stones, that stone at the very top of the arch, that is the keystone. Once you remove that keystone, the entire arch is going to collapse upon itself. Same type of thing here. If you don't have a good performance evaluation system, your entire human resource management process is going to collapse. You're not going to know how to do training and development. You're not going to be able to do sanctioning and discipline. You're not going to be able to do any of that if you don't have a good performance evaluation process. But there are a lot of different performance evaluation formats that we can use. A lot of you have probably lived through performance evaluations in the past, so we won't spend a lot of time on this, but as you probably already know, the most common performance evaluation format is graphic rating. And graphic rating will be those categories, those ordinal categories of excellent, good, fair, poor, however they're written. You have those ordinal types of Likert categories. And then you'll have a statement such as the employee's punctuality, how is the employee's punctuality or something like that. It's excellent, it's good, it's fair, it's poor. The quality of work of the employee is excellent, good, fair, poor. The good thing is that that's really easy to do. The bad thing is that it leads to a lot of errors. And one of the most common errors that we see in a graphic rating approach is what's known as the halo effect. The halo effect is where, as you might guess, the manager, the evaluator just says, I like this person, and so I'm going to give them all excellent scores regardless of what the prompt is. Makes them look angelic, hence the halo effect. They're also overly sensitive to things like the recency effect. The recency effect says that I will evaluate this person based upon my most recent interaction with them. And so if I had a negative interaction with this employee, then I'm going to give them poor marks regardless of what the prompt on the evaluation is. But the biggest problem with graphic rating is it doesn't provide formative feedback. It doesn't provide the narrative feedback that employees need in order to improve their performance. So if you're at a good level, you want to go to an excellent level, you don't know how to do it because that feedback is not provided. So usually in a graphic rating, we'll combine that with an essay approach so that we'll be able to provide that narrative feedback to give that formative feedback to the employee on how to change their behavior in order to meet that higher expectation and get that higher performance level. Just very quickly, I will point you to the one at the bottom of the screen. That's BARS. That stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. Behaviorally anchored rating scale. And to see an example of that, you have to go no further than just looking at the typical syllabus in a graduate program. Grading rubrics are essentially behaviorally anchored rating scales. So to get an A on this essay, here are the behaviors that you have to exhibit. So to get an A, your essay must develop new information, a new way of looking at the issue, must be clear, must be comprehensive, must be devoid of typographical errors. So those are the behaviors that exist to exhibit to get an A on that essay. To get a B on that essay, perhaps it has to be clear, it has to be comprehensive, it has to be devoid of typographical errors, but it also reiterates existing information. So that's all well and good, but you're not creating anything new like you would with a grade of A. So that would then give you a grade of B, and then so on and so on. The nice thing about anchoring these ratings in the behaviors is that you know exactly what behavior you need to exhibit in order to get the evaluation that you would like to get in the future. But regardless of what format you use, the moral of the story is that the more you can involve employees in the evaluation process, the more likely they are to trust the results of that process. So if you can involve employees in the development of the performance evaluation, so they actually have a hand in developing their own performance evaluation, they have some skin in the game. And so they know how it's put together because they were a part of putting it together. So if they trust the process, they're much more likely to trust the results of that process. Then based upon the evaluation results, we then have to discipline, sanction our employees if necessary. We have to engage in training and development if necessary. There is a misunderstanding, as I said before, that it is impossible to terminate a career civil servant. That is not true. Career civil servants can be terminated, but only for cause, only for deficient performance, for violation of laws. There must be a documented cause for that person's termination. So documentation is essential here. And so based upon the performance evaluation, if that performance evaluation is subpar, you then have to provide opportunities for targeted training and development. Whether or not the employee takes you up on those opportunities, that's going to be up to the employee. But if the employee, you offer that to the employee takes you up on that training, you then reevaluate the performance after the training. The performance is still subpar, then you would have to offer them more training and development. Then you would have to reassess their performance. If it's still subpar, offer them more training and development. And eventually then, after you offer them all of these opportunities to mitigate the deficiencies in their performance, if their performance is still unacceptable, then you can move into the area of potential termination. Usually employees will be placed on probation to signal to them that termination may be coming down the road if that performance doesn't improve. But for career civil servants, you need to document everything. You need to document subpar performance, and you have to document the opportunities for training that have been provided to that employee. So it is a difficult process going through the human resource management process in the public sector. We have a lot more rules and regulations and stipulations that we need to adhere to in the public sector. You'll learn a lot more about those rules and regulations when you get into your 577 course. But our purpose here over the past hour and a half is just to introduce the management of human resources as a primary function in the field of public administration, primary function of public administrators on a daily basis. 85 to 90% of your organization's budget will go toward paying your human resources. So that just kind of signals to you how important effective management of human resources will be to all public organizations. So hopefully this has kind of provided with you with a little insight into some of the things you'll talk about when you get to 577. You'll just have the opportunity in 577 to talk about all those issues much more in depth than what we're able to do here in this type of a survey-oriented type of course. So that's the management of human resources. Any questions, any observations or clarifications needed on any of this information up to this point? Okay. I see that we are quickly approaching 5:30, so I think it is certainly time for our evening break. Let's take a break until 5:40. Come back at 5:40, and then we'll talk about our last topic for this course, which is the management of financial resources, and get you ready then for PPA 555, Public Budgeting and Finance. So I will see you back here at 5. Welcome back from break, and we are back for the stretch run. And so this is our last topic that we cover in this course, and that's our final function, which is managing financial resources to then get you ready for PPA 555. So I'm going to try and curtail my comments. I, for years, taught public budgeting and financial management, and so I'm going to try not to talk too much about this because you'll get all of that information in 555. But whenever I used to teach budgeting, one of the first things that we'd always start with is a definition of what a budget is. I think we all kind of have a good sense of what a budget is, even if you haven't worked with one in the public sector. Some of you may manage a budget in your organizations, and so you're very aware of budgets. But essentially, with a budget, the simplest definition is it's a statement, a prospective statement of what we are spending our money on and how much money we are spending. It is prospective because it tells us what we're spending our money on and how much money we're spending in the next fiscal year. So it's kind of this statement of dollars and cents. However, I would argue that it goes beyond that. And I would recommend that we think about budgets as more of a statement of societal priorities. As governments, we are always faced with infinite demands and we have finite resources to address those demands. Whenever infinite demands come into contact with finite resources, we have to make choices. We have to prioritize. And so in the next fiscal year, if we decide that we are going to spend more money on K through 12 education, there's an opportunity cost that we're probably going to have to spend less money on some other policy or some other program. There's not an infinite amount of money that we can put into our budgets. We have to make those trade-offs. And so when you think about a budget as a statement of societal priorities, it really does elevate the importance of a budget beyond what we would normally think is just numbers on a page. So as you go into 5T5, really do think about a budget as a statement of societal priorities. There are usually two different types of budgets that are used at the local level of government. There are operating budgets and there are capital budgets. The operating budget is used for the day-to-day functioning of an organization. And so your salary, your benefits, your supplies, those types of things are paid for out of the operating budget. But then most local governments will maintain a separate capital budget. The capital budget are for capital projects. These very high price tag, long lifespan, non-recurring types of projects. So things such as a construction of a city hall, construction of a school, buying a fleet of police vehicles, construction of an aquatic center. Those are going to cost you tens of millions of dollars, and they're not something you're going to do every single year. So those are considered capital projects, and those are usually budgeted within a capital budget. The nice thing about using a separate capital budget is, number one, those big projects then don't blow a hole out of your operating budget. Local governments in the vast majority of states are required to avoid a deficit. And so they're required, at least on paper, to balance their revenues and expenditures. If you have a $150 million operating budget and you're constructing a $50 million city hall, and you dump that $50 million project into your $150 million operating budget, it's going to blow a huge hole in that budget. It'll be impossible for you to balance your budget. So we segregate those high price tag capital projects into a separate capital budget. It also helps local governments with their credit ratings as well, because they can maintain their balance and their revenues, expenditures, and their operating budget. And by segregating into a separate capital budget, you end up getting a better credit rating. It is also a way in which we can spend more time and be more rational in making decisions about these capital projects. We had talked last time about the four different decision-making models: rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can. We say we have glimmers of rationality every now and then in our decision-making. Well, by segregating these projects into a separate capital budget, you can spend more time analyzing them, put more resources behind analyzing them, and really do a more rational job of deciding whether or not this is a capital project that we want to fund. Operating budgets, on the other hand, tend to be much more incremental decision-making, in that the amount we're going to spend on supplies this year is going to be very similar to what amount we spent last year. We'll take what we spent last year, we'll add on an inflationary factor of maybe 2 or 3%, and that will then dictate what we are going to spend this year. So operating budgets tend to be much more incremental. Capital budgets tend to have a more rational thought process that underpins them. Now, all that being said, it's state and local governments that maintain a separate capital budget. The federal government typically does not. The federal government uses a unified federal budget. They're able to take all these capital projects and dump them into the unified budget because the unified budget is so big at the federal level. Now, you are talking about billions and billions of dollars in the federal budget. So one $50 million project is a drop in the bucket, and you will even notice it if it's in the unified budget of the federal government. But at the same local level, we do tend to maintain separate capital budgets alongside our operating budgets. So how do we put budgets together? The process of budgeting is usually comprised of four different phases: planning, formulation, execution, and evaluation. And these four phases are common to the national, state, as well as local levels. But let's take a look at how these phases play out in the federal budgeting process, because state and local processes are kind of indexed to that federal process. And so they kind of build off of the way in which the federal government does its budgeting, for better or for worse. Now, you could teach not only an entire course, you could have an entire degree program that analyzes the federal budget process. There are people in Congress who have served in Congress for 30 years who will admit to you that they are not clear on every single nuance and detail in the federal budgeting process. It is such a complex, convoluted process. But in a few minutes here, let's at least present these four phases in the federal process and what happens in each one of these phases. So the first phase of the budgeting process is preparation. Before we can know how much money we are spending, we have to know how much money we have to spend. So before we can determine our expenditures, we have to determine our revenues. So in preparation, we will do revenue forecasting. So we will project how much revenue we anticipate generating next year, so we'll know how much money we have then to spend. There are two main organizations that are involved in preparation. There's the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as OMB. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, serves the president. It is an executive branch organization. Then there's what's known as the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office is a legislative organization created by and serving Congress. So they're kind of a counterweight to each other. They will produce these revenue forecasts, how much forecast they're projecting we're going to generate next fiscal year. And then they will also do what are called expenditure estimates, where they will say, given the current level of services that we provided last year, how much will it cost us to do this same level of services in the next fiscal year? Because again, we have inflationary factors. And so what you did last year may cost you 3 or 4 more percent to do that this year. So they'll put together revenue forecasts as well as expenditure estimates. The moral of the story in terms of the reports produced by OMB and CBO in preparation is that OMB tends to be a lot more optimistic than CBO. Their revenue forecasts tend to be much rosier than the revenue forecast that we get from the Congressional Budget Office. And the reason for that is that OMB is serving an audience of one. They serve the president. And so in order to make the president's policy initiatives look more realistic, they may over forecast revenue more so than the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office serves 535 people, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate, so they tend to be a little bit more realistic with their projections. So at the federal level in preparation, we have OMB and we have CBO. Here in the state of California, we have the Department of Finance, which is the corollary to the Office of Management and Budget. It serves the governor and helps the governor put their budget together. And then we have the Legislative Analyst Office, or the LAO, which is kind of the corollary organization to the Congressional Budget Office at the national level. So during preparation, we've got OMB and CBO doing all these revenue forecasts and all these expenditure estimates. Then the Office of Management and Budget will put out a call for budget requests, and they'll put out a call to all the departments, all the agencies, all the regulatory commissions across the entire federal government, asking them to submit their budget requests. Once OMB receives those budget requests, OMB will then reduce them. Almost invariably, they'll make reductions. And then those reduced budget requests will then become the president's budget, the executive budget. Now, this preparation phase usually starts at least a year or year and a half before the actual fiscal year begins. So this is going to start well in advance of the fiscal year that we are creating the budget for. Usually OMB needs to have this budget done in January. Then the president typically gives their State of the Union address the end of January, and there's flexibility there. We know from our reading of the Constitution, Article 2 tells us that presidents must update Congress on the State of the Union, quote unquote, from time to time. So there's no annual requirement. There's no requirement in terms of the forum in which this needs to be done. But traditionally, what will happen is in January, the Speaker of the House will issue an invitation to the president for that president to come before a joint session of Congress and do the State of the Union address. A lot of what is said in that State of the Union address is going to come directly from the executive budget. After the State of the Union address, once we get into early February, the president will then release their budget and will release their budget to Congress and to the media. This used to be a big photo opportunity. And so back in the day, before a lot of electronic communication, you would have a photo opportunity where you would have all these paper copies of the federal budget. And then all members of the media would show up and would get their paper copy of the federal budget, which would be yay high, and go walking out of the room as if they're going to read every page of that executive budget. Today, it's all done electronically, obviously, but that gets released to the media in February and gets released to Congress as well. Once the president's budget goes to Congress, we shift from the preparation phase to the formulation phase. And again, that's going to happen sometime probably in early February. Once the president's budget goes to Congress, its initial starting point in Congress will be with the budget committees. There is a budget committee in the House and there's a budget committee in the Senate. And that's where the budget starts. Those budget committees have the requirement for passing what is known as a concurrent resolution on the budget. And this concurrent resolution on the budget will establish the maximum spending levels for each programmatic area in the federal budget. So this concurrent resolution on the budget, they will say, here's the maximum amount of money that we can spend on education. Here's the maximum amount that can be spent in health and human services, and so on and so on. The goal of the concurrent resolution on the budget is to impose some spending discipline on Congress. Now, we can make arguments about how binding this resolution really is. Congress oftentimes will blow right past those limitations, and those limitations sometimes don't mean anything. But at least in theory, it's supposed to impose some fiscal discipline on how much money Congress is spending in each of those programmatic areas. And typically, we look at 12 programmatic areas for what we call discretionary spending. Then the budget will go to the appropriations committees, and that's its next stop. There's an appropriations committee in the House, and there is one in the Senate. Each appropriations committee will have 12 separate subcommittees. Each subcommittee is responsible for a different programmatic area in the budget. So there'll be an education appropriations subcommittee. There'll be an agriculture appropriations subcommittee. Those subcommittees then have the responsibility of passing out their own appropriation bills for their programmatic area after they make amendments and hold hearings. Then those bills go to the parent appropriations committee. The appropriations committee will then hold their own hearings and do their own markup and add their own amendments, and will then pass that appropriation bill onto the floor of the House or onto the floor of the Senate, depending upon which body you're talking about. Now, before we get further into this process with appropriation bills, I think we have to recognize that there are two different types of spending in the federal budget process. There is what's known as discretionary spending, and there's what's known as mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So it's spending that if Congress wants to reduce spending on program X, it can just decide we're going to spend less money on program X. It can do that directly. However, there is some spending that's considered to be mandatory. Mandatory spending will be things such as the interest on the national debt. Once Congress borrows money, Congress has to repay that money, principal and interest payments. It doesn't have a choice. It cannot default on that debt without killing the credit rating of the federal government, which would then make it next to impossible to borrow money in the future. So since they borrow the money, they have to repay it. It's mandatory. They don't have direct control over it. Another example of mandatory spending that I think we've mentioned in an earlier session, entitlement programs. Entitlement programs are eligibility based. And so if you meet the legal eligibility guidelines, you are legally entitled to the benefits from that program. So if Congress wants to spend less on that entitlement program, they have to change the eligibility requirements. You change eligibility requirements not through the appropriations process, but through what's called the authorization process. So discretionary spending goes through the appropriations process, through these appropriation subcommittees and appropriation committee. Then mandatory spending will go through authorizations committees, because in order to lower the spending, you have to first change those eligibility requirements through authorization language, authorization legislation. But back to the appropriation side, because the discretionary spending, that's where we see a lot of those battles occurring. So once the House Appropriations Committee passes an appropriation bill and the Senate Appropriations Committee passes their appropriation bill, chances are those two bills are not identical to each other. There will be a House version and there will be a Senate version. We know, according to our reading of Section 1 of the Constitution, before a bill can go to the president for signature, it must first pass the House and the Senate in identical version. So that's when we have to have conference committees. And these conference committees will hammer out the differences between the House version and the Senate version, come up with a uniform version of that bill. That appropriation bill then goes back to the floor of the House for passage and back to the floor of the Senate for passage before going to the president for the president's signature. That's for one appropriation bill. Remember, we have 12 of these appropriation bills that are going through this process. So you can see how it's a very protracted, very difficult process to get these 12 appropriation bills done. All 12 of these appropriation bills technically need to be passed and signed by the president no later than the last day of the preceding fiscal year, which is September 30th. The federal fiscal year runs from October 1st until September 30th. For all those appropriation bills that have not been passed by September 30th, once that clock turns to midnight on October 1st, those agencies in those programmatic areas where the appropriation bill has not yet been passed, they now lack the legal authority to spend money. Unless Congress passes a continuing resolution to keep these agencies operating, you will then end up with a partial government shutdown. It's partial because it will be a shutdown for all those agencies where their appropriation bills have not been passed. Typically, in recent years, what we have seen is we have been able to pass maybe 3 or 4 or 5 appropriation bills by September 30th, but the majority of appropriation bills still remain unpassed when the new fiscal year begins. So Congress will pass continuing resolutions. And we saw that this year. The continuing resolution will say, we will fund these agencies at 80% of the amount they were funded last year for a period of time, usually for either 2 or 4 weeks. So they'll say, we will fund the Department of Agriculture at 80% of what the Department of Agriculture was funded at for these 2 weeks last year. So it at least allows the Department of Agriculture to keep the wheels running and to keep operating by that continuing resolution. Those continuing resolutions are temporary. So when they expire, if Congress has still not approved the appropriation bill, then you'll have another continuing resolution, and then another one, and then another one, until finally either Congress or the president will lose their appetite with continuing resolutions. And they'll say no more continuing resolutions. At that point in time, that's when we run headlong into a partial government shutdown. And we have seen these partial government shutdowns become more and more frequent with each passing budget cycle. And we've talked about partial government shutdowns when we talked about the Anti-Deficiency Act, back when we talked about accountability and ethics. We gave you an example of how the Anti-Deficiency Act precluded the Trump administration from paying IRS agents in the absence of an approved and signed appropriation bill. So you're looking straight at a partial government shutdown at that point in time. To avoid a partial government shutdown, what Congress usually does is it takes all of these unpassed appropriation bills and it will cobble them all together into a mammoth, unwieldy piece of legislation known as an OBRA. And OBRA stands for an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. An Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And the emphasis is on that O, omnibus. It is a huge piece of legislation, which includes not just the appropriation bills that have not yet been passed, but a lot of other additional spending as well. So to get people who were originally opposed to this appropriation bill to approve this OBRA, you then have to kind of engage in this log rolling, this quid pro quo, where you will say, okay, representative from West Virginia, in order to get you to vote yes on this OBRA, we will take this bridge that you really want to get built and have your name on, and we will put this in the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act just to get you to vote yes for it. And then we do that to all those members who originally would not support the appropriation bill. So as you can see, these OBRAs end up leading to a lot of overspending. We've always heard about pork barrel spending, all this unnecessary spending. This is where a lot of that unnecessary spending comes from, these Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts. This is the way in which we usually do our budgeting. It's not the way budgeting is supposed to work, but it's the way the federal government usually gets a budget done. It's no way to make a budget, but it's the way they always make their budgets. So once we have a budget in place, whether it's through passing the 12 appropriation bills as we are supposed to, or whether it's through an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, we are then ready to spend the money. And so when the new fiscal year begins on October 1st, we then shift from formulation into execution. The execution phase will last during that fiscal year, from October 1st to the following September 30th, when we're actually going out there, implementing the budget and spending the money. Then at the end of the fiscal year, we then move from execution to evaluation. We will then go and audit the books. We'll do our financial and legal audits to make sure money is being spent in the legally appropriated manner. We'll do our performance and our management audits to make sure that we are spending the money in an effective way to help us achieve our goals and our objectives. What makes the federal budgeting process so difficult is that it is overlapping. So when we are in the formulation process for one fiscal year, we are in the preparation process for the next fiscal year. And we are in the execution process for the current fiscal year. And we are in the evaluation process for the preceding fiscal year. So we'll have 4 fiscal years all overlapping on top of each other, just in different phases of the budgeting process. And that, in a big nutshell, is kind of how the federal government does its budgeting, the process of budgeting at the federal level. Now, here in California, it is a little bit different. We don't have all these separate appropriation bills. We have what is called a budget bill. That budget bill is put together by the Department of Finance and the governor in January. It then gets transmitted to the state legislature, but the state legislature doesn't do a lot of its budget work in earnest until it gets the results of this thing called the May revise. And one of the most important budget documents here in California is this May revise. And if you work in a local agency or a state agency, you are painfully aware of the impacts of the May revise. So when the budget bill was put together in January, it was built upon certain assumptions in terms of the amount of revenue we were going to be able to generate. By the subsequent May, we now know better how much revenue we actually generated. So if our actual revenue is trailing behind what we projected we would be able to raise, we're going to have to make cuts to that budget. And so the May revise will then change the governor's budget, make those kind of painful cuts, and then the state legislature will then have to consider that revised budget after the May revise. We saw that this year, this May. where we were running behind our revenue projections. And so the governor had to make some major changes to his budget bill. And then that revised budget is then considered by the state legislature throughout the rest of May and throughout the beginning of June. By June 15th, that budget must be approved by the state legislature, then signed by the governor on June 30th for the beginning of the state fiscal year, which is on July 1st. So here in California, we operate on a different fiscal calendar than the federal government. Federal government runs from October 1st to September 30th. We here in California run from July 1st until June 30th. But even when that budget is signed by the governor and we move into the execution phase here in California, some local agencies will be relatively hesitant to go out there and start spending money, because a lot of the details in how that money specifically needs to be spent have not been agreed upon yet. Here in California, after the budget is passed, throughout the rest of June and throughout July, we will get these trailer bills that will be coming out of the state legislature. These trailer bills will add all the specifics to how to spend all the money on all these state programs that are authorized under the governor's budget. So sometimes local governments will want to kind of cool their jets for a while, wait for these trailer bills to come out so they really understand exactly how to implement all these programs and how to spend all of this money. Now, even though the federal government has a lot of trouble getting its budget done on time, we have very little trouble getting our budget done on time here in California. And the reason why it's easier here is kind of twofold. One reason is that we have unified government. So we have the governor is of the same party as the supermajorities in the Assembly and the Senate. In the Assembly and the Senate, the Democratic Party has a supermajority of 3/4, not just 2/3, but 3/4. Also, having a Democratic governor means that it's much easier to get that budget passed. The second reason why it's easier for us to get budgets done here in California is somewhat recently we made changes to how the budget's passed in the state legislature. Historically, in order to pass the budget, the state legislature needed to have a 2/3 majority to pass a budget. That was reduced to a simple majority. So it's very easy to get a simple majority when you control 3/4 of the entire body. So it's relatively simple to get that done. Now, even though it only takes a simple majority to pass a budget in the California legislature, if you want to raise taxes, that is still going to require a 2/3 majority. But again, the Democrats have almost 3/4 majority, so it's relatively easy for them to get that 2/3 majority to increase taxes. So we really don't have a lot of trouble getting a budget done here in California. Do we have trouble balancing the budget? Yes, especially in the post-COVID era. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the end of our discussion tonight. So that's the process of budgeting at the federal level, as well as the process of budgeting here in the state of California. So what do budget documents look like? Well, again, that's going to depend. That's going to depend on what you want to accomplish with your budget. And there's a very famous budgeting article that was published several years ago by an author by the name of Schick. And Schick, in his article, argued that there are 3 different purposes of a budget document. We can use a budget for the purpose of control, to control our expenditures, how much money we're spending, and what we are spending that money on. We can also use a budget document for the purpose of management, to use the budget to help better manage the operations of our organization. And then third, we can use a budget document for the purpose of strategic planning. We can use it as a strategic planning tool to help us plan how all the operations and all the things we are doing as an organization relate together in helping us achieve our goals and our objectives. So the type of budget you use will depend upon what you are trying to achieve. If you are trying to achieve control over your expenditures, the first type of budget listed on the screen will help you with that, and that's a traditional type of budget known as a line item budget. Now, for the sake of time, we are not going to go through examples of each of these budget formats. You will get that ad nauseum in your 555 course. But if you kind of want a foreshadowing of it, I have provided links on our Canvas site to give you examples of what each of these budget formats look like. But the first one is traditional line item budget. If you've done any work with budgets, you've seen this before. It's a very simple line item spreadsheet whereby you will have the line item, which is what we're spending the money on, otherwise known as the object of expenditure, and then how much money is being spent on that object. So salaries and the amount being spent, benefits, the amount being spent, supplies, and the amount being spent. And that's all you get in a line item budget. It's very quick and it's very easy to put together. It also allows you to control how much money you're spending and what that money is being spent on. The disadvantage, though, is it doesn't give you any other information. It doesn't give you any information about how well you are spending the money. So in putting together a traditional line item budget, you'll look at last year's budget and you'll take what you spent last year on those objects, add on an inflationary factor, and then that determines what you'll be spending in this next fiscal year. It's a very incremental type of decision making. Line item budgeting is done by just about every local government. However, some local governments will then add on a second format, which is a performance-based budget. And in a performance-based budget, we will build in performance expectations. So if we spend this money on this activity, this is how we expect to perform in that activity. So an example could be, I used to use a textbook by John Mikesell when I taught budgeting, and he's from Indiana University. And so he uses a lot of snow-related examples. And so the example he always used, which I think is a good one, is for a snow removal program. And so let's put together a performance-based budget for a snow removal program. Well, when you spend money in a snow removal program, obviously your ultimate goal is to remove snow from the streets to make the streets safer. So you'll be removing snow through an activity such as snow plowing. So how many miles of laned roads will you be plowing with your snow plows? And how much money are you spending to plow that number of lane miles? Salting of the streets. One of the ways in which you can get salt to evaporate is by using rock salt. And so how many pounds of rock salt and how many lane miles of road will be rock salted? And you're spending money on these activities. The question, though, is what are the performance indicators of how well we are clearing the roads with plowing and salting of the roads? Well, one performance outcome could be the number of accidents where snow is a contributing factor. That's a performance indicator. So if the number of incidents where snow is a contributing factor has gone down, then ostensibly we are doing a more effective job of clearing the roads. How about citizen complaints? The number of citizen complaints we get for roads that have not yet been cleared. The less complaints we get, the more effective we are at clearing those roads. So you incorporate those performance indicators into your budget. Typically, when local governments do a performance-based budget, they will start with a traditional line item approach, and then they'll go ahead and incorporate those performance indicators. And that's what's known as a performance-based budget. The nice thing here is that a performance-based budget helps you achieve your second goal of a budget, which is management. It helps you more efficiently and effectively manage the activities that you are funding within your organization. Your third budget format is a program-based budget. Program-based budgets are oriented around the third purpose, which is planning. They allow you to strategically plan the operations of your organization. So let's say, for instance, you have a program that you are funding that's called Protection of Persons and Property. That's the program. Some of the activities that help meet the goals of that program will be done by the police department. Some will be done by the fire department. Some will be done by the Department of Emergency Preparedness. But when you organize your budget, you don't organize it according to police department and fire department. You organize it according to the overarching program, which is protection of persons and property, irrespective of which department is contributing to that program. One of the common strategies that you'll learn about in 555 in program budgeting is something called crosswalking. In crosswalking, you'll create a very simple matrix. Arrayed across your top in your columns will be your program goals that you are trying to achieve. Then along your side of your matrix, on your rows, will be the different activities that you are funding. And then you'll just go through your cells and tick off which activity contributes to which programmatic goal. Then all those activities that contribute to the same programmatic goal all get budgeted together under that program of protection of persons and property. So this is a holistic change to the way in which the budget format works. Line item and performance-based budgeting will be organized according to department, unit, or division. Program-based budgeting will be organized according to the overarching program. And then your fourth budget format is really more of a process, and that's what's called a zero-based budget. Now, in line item budgeting, you would take what you did last year and build upon that. In zero-based budgeting, you go back and you re-justify why you are funding the programs and activities that you are funding. So zero-based budgeting process is really a bottom-up process. So you look at your organization and you identify the lowest level in your organization where budgeting decisions can be made. Those are referred to as your decision units. Each decision unit will then create a series of decision packages, different alternatives for how you will then fund different types of activities. You'll rank and prioritize all those different decision packages, then send them up the organization chart to be re-ranked and reprioritized, and so on and so on. The problem with zero-based budgeting is it creates a mountain of paperwork. If you have 10 decision units and each unit is creating 20 decision packages, you're creating 200 different decision packages. Each decision package could be 20 to 50 pages long. So you kind of get the idea of just how much reading is involved in zero-based budgeting. Because it's so unrealistic, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll modify it and do a modified zero-based budgeting approach. We'll say, let's take 80% of our budget and do it according to a traditional line item approach. Then take 20% and do zero-based budgeting with it. The next year, do zero-based budgeting with a different 20%, and then a different 20%, and then a different 20%. So that after 5 years, every part of your budget has been subjected to zero-based budgeting at least once. It's a much more rational, much more planning-oriented way to put a budget together. Now, that being said, you're not going to see zero-based budgeting used very frequently at all at the local level of government. Local governments tend to do line item, maybe a little bit of performance. In terms of program-based budgeting, that goes on in places like the Department of Defense and in some states. Zero-based budgeting usually happens at the state level. And so states like Virginia, states like Texas have been known to do some of this modified zero-based budgeting. But again, you'll learn a lot more about these formats when we get to 555, but this is kind of a foreshadowing of what different types of budgets can look like. And if you want to see examples, I have links on our Canvas site. But up to this point in time, we have been talking primarily about expenditures and the expenditures in a budget. But we know to make those expenditures, to spend that money, we have to first raise the revenue. So let's talk very briefly about where revenue comes from for public organizations. Comes from two main sources: taxation and non-tax sources of revenue. So in terms of tax-based sources of revenue, there are the three main tax-based sources of revenue that we are all familiar with: property taxes, income taxes, and sales taxes. Property taxes are what we call an ability to pay type of tax, in that you pay the tax based upon the value of your property, the assessed value of your property. Now, we know that there can be a disconnect between your income level and the value of your property. And so if you have a high value property, but you just lost your job and you don't have much income, you're going to pay your property taxes out of the income you're earning. You're probably not going to refinance your home just to pay your property taxes. So whenever there is that disconnect between somebody's ability to pay and how much they owe in property taxes, the property tax can end up becoming what we call a regressive form of taxation. Regressive taxes are taxes that impose a heavier burden on lower income as opposed to higher income individuals. Here in California, we have a very unique system of property taxation given to us in virtue of Proposition 13. You'll learn a lot about Prop 13 and how it has been amended in your 555 course. But for our purposes now, what Proposition 13 initially did is it imposed a 1% property tax rate limit, and then it limited the increase in assessed value of property to no more than 2% per year. Taken together, what it did is it limited the amount of access local governments had to property tax revenue. So much so that a lot of local governments in California have moved away from relying upon the property tax and are now relying more on non-tax sources of revenue. The property tax, though, is still the prominent tax at the local level of government. Then we have our income taxes. We know we have a federal income tax, and we also have an income tax at the state level here in California. We do not have the traditional type of income tax at the local level that you see in a lot of other states. People tend to prefer the income tax over the property tax because income taxes are viewed as being fairer. They're viewed as being more fair because of the graduated marginal income tax bracket system. So if you make a good amount of money and you're at the 33% tax bracket rate, you do not pay your entire income at 33% taxation. Up to a certain threshold of your income, you'll pay at 10%, then the next threshold will be at 15%, then the next increment may be at 22%, and so on and so on. By doing that, it reduces the burden on taxpayers. Also, we have a system of deductions and tax credits that will also reduce the tax burden for income taxpayers. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017 fundamentally changed the federal income tax system by increasing the size of the standard deduction. By making the standard deduction bigger, the goal was to induce more people to claim the standard deduction as opposed to doing an itemization of their deductions. In addition to that, it also placed a cap, a $10,000 limit on the what's called the SALT, the state and local tax deduction. So that hurt taxpayers in high tax states like California and New York. There have been a lot of discussions in Congress and among presidential candidates about removing that SALT deduction limitation. We'll see if that ever does happen. But that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was a huge transformation of our federal income tax system. But the income tax remains the prominent source of revenue for the federal government and also a very healthy source of revenue for many states, including California. Then your third type of taxation is much different. So the property tax is ability to pay. Your ability to pay is gauged as the assessed value of your property. The income tax is an ability to pay tax gauged as your adjusted gross income. The sales tax is a benefits received tax, and that you are being taxed based upon the benefit that you are receiving from buying and consuming some type of a commodity. As such, it's based upon a benefits received principle. The problem with the sales tax is it can be highly regressive because we do not take into account your ability to pay when you pay the sales tax. So you go in there and you purchase that candy bar and there's a tax on that candy bar. We don't ask what your income level is. We don't ask what the value of your home is. So sometimes you see the sales tax actually impacting lower income individuals more than upper income individuals. And that is especially true if you don't exempt the staples of life from the sales tax. So if you don't exempt things like food and things like pharmaceutical medications, the sales tax can be a very highly regressive tax. Sales taxes are used by state governments. They're also used by local governments as well. And here in California, we have local option sales taxes. So the sales tax that you pay in Los Angeles County is going to be different than the sales tax that you pay in Ventura County. So those are your primary tax-based sources of revenue. Then there are non-tax sources of revenue, things such as user charges and user fees. Now, governments will oftentimes use these terms interchangeably. There is a difference. User charges those are types of revenue that are generated from someone consuming some type of a service, the benefit they get from consuming a service. So the amount of electricity that you use, you will pay a charge for the amount of electricity that you use. You are getting a benefit from consuming that service. User fees, by contrast, are usually not linked to the consumption of some type of a service. They are linked to the participation in some type of an activity. So you want to drive your car on the road, you have to register it, you have to pay a registration fee. You want to hunt, you have to get a hunting license and pay a hunting license fee. So that's the difference between charges and fees. But what we have seen is that subsequent to Prop 13, as local governments lost access to the property tax, they then shifted their focus onto some of these non-tax sources of revenue to such an extent that the average city in California generates more money from user charges and user fees than it does from the property tax. Now, that's true for the average city in California. Cities here in Southern California tend to still be relatively reliant upon property taxes. So you kind of have a disconnect between what goes on here in Southern California compared to the average across the entire state. So most local governments in most states will have constitutional provisions that will require them to balance their budgets so that their revenues are at least equal to their expenditures. When your revenues do not equal your expenditures, that's what then gives you what's called a deficit. A deficit is an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. The federal government has run a deficit every single year since 1969, with the exception of 2 years. Other than those 2 years, we've run a deficit every single year. State and local governments, even though it looks like they may be having a deficit, there are ways they can overcome that deficit, at least on paper. And the primary way to do that is by borrowing money. So let's talk a bit about borrowing money and the different ways in which governments borrow money. There's long-term and there's short-term borrowing. Long-term borrowing takes the form of what's called a bond. Short-term borrowing takes the form of what's called a note. Long-term debt is usually more than 1 year in maturity. Short-term debt is less than 1 year in maturity. So the types of long-term bonds that governments issue, usually to construct capital projects, are things such as general obligation bonds. A general obligation bond is kind of the traditional way in which governments borrow money. In a general obligation bond, the government will commit all of its resources, its full faith and credit, to repaying investors who purchase this debt, who purchase these bonds. So that means the government will do anything they have to do. If they have to do a reduction in force, if they have to sell surplus property, although there are limitations on how you can use that revenue, they will cut other programs. They'll do whatever they need to do to repay investors. We know whenever you do investments, whenever you buy investments, there is this relationship between risk and reward. The higher the risk to the investor, the more reward they're going to anticipate. The lower the risk, the less the reward. This general obligation bond is a very low risk investment. Since the government's pledging all of their resources to repay the debt, it means the investor knows they will get their money back. And so they demand less of a return. That means the interest rate is going to be low for a general obligation bond, and it's going to be much cheaper for governments to issue general obligation bonds. The problem with the general obligation bond is in most states, you need to have a supermajority voter approval in order to issue a general obligation bond. Here in California, traditionally, it's a 2/3 voter approval to be able to issue a general obligation bond. Now, there is an exception to that, and it's called Proposition 39. Proposition 39 says that school districts can issue general obligation bonds with only a 55% voter approval. But when they do that, they also then have to set up a citizen oversight committee to oversee how the bond proceeds are being used. And they also have to subject themselves to frequent audits of how the bond proceeds are being used. There is a proposition on the ballot this November here in California that would extend that 55% voter approval to general obligation bonds that are issued to create affordable housing. So they're going to try and extend that 55% approval to affordable housing bonds as well. But those are what are called general obligation bonds. Low risk, low reward, inexpensive ways to issue debt, but you have to get voter approval. Second type of long-term bond is what's known as a revenue bond. Revenue bonds are usually issued for the construction of a revenue-generating enterprise. So you're going to use the proceeds to build a recreation center. You're going to charge people a fee to use that recreation center, then collect those fees, and then use that revenue to repay the debt. So the debt is repaid by securing the revenue from the operation of the facility that's being constructed. That's a much higher risk type of debt for an investor because they're not guaranteed to get the money back. The government is not saying we're going to do everything at our disposal. The government is saying we're just going to use the revenue from this facility to repay the debt. So since there's a much higher risk, then investors demand a much higher reward. So the interest rate is going to be much higher for a revenue bond, and it's going to be much more expensive to issue a revenue bond. Sometimes if governments are creating a structure, a facility that will generate revenue, but not enough revenue to completely repay the debt, they'll use a combination of general obligation and revenue that's known as a double barrel bond. So part of the bond will be secured with a full faith and credit pledge from the government. Part of the bond will be secured with the revenue generated from the facility. As you might guess, the interest rate for double barrel bonds will fall in between general obligation and revenue. So general obligation has the lowest interest rate, revenue has the highest interest rate, double barrel interest rates come in right in the middle. So the type of bond that you issue will depend upon the type of facility that you are building with that bond. Then we have short-term debt, and this is referred to as a note. Notes mature usually in less than 1 year, and governments will oftentimes use notes to offset an imbalance between their revenues and their expenditures. So if they're looking at a deficit, they know constitutionally they can't run a deficit. So what they will do is they will issue a note called a revenue anticipation note, saying that we're going to borrow this money to avoid a deficit, and we'll use the revenue that is coming in next month in the next fiscal year and use that to then repay the debt. Hence the reason why it's called a revenue anticipation note. If you are doing that though, if you are borrowing money to offset an operating deficit, that is what we would consider to be a bad use of debt. However, if you are issuing long-term debt to construct a necessary and needed physical structure like a recreation center or a city hall, that is not necessarily considered to be bad debt. So how good the debt is really depends upon the purpose of why you are borrowing that money. So to kind of wrap all this up in the last few minutes we have together, budgeting in the public sector, especially at the federal level, is, for lack of a better term, a mess. We never get our budget done on time, and we never get our budget done in balance. We have run deficits every single year since 1969, except for the years 1999 and 2000. So what we have tried to do over the past several decades is reform the federal budgeting process to try and get our budgets done on time and to try and eliminate deficits. So very quickly here in the 1970s, we had this thing called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The purpose of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was to change the federal budget process to help streamline it so we could get our budgets done on time. It created the House and the Senate Budget Committee. It required those budget committees to pass these budget resolutions. It changed the fiscal year from October 1st until September 30th. Did all these fundamental changes to the budget process. It didn't work. The bill was passed in 1974. Fast forward 10 years to the mid-1980s, we were still having trouble getting our budget done on time. So in the 1980s, we said, let's stop focusing so much on the process and let's focus more on deficits. How can we eliminate deficits and balance our budget? So we got this piece of legislation in 1985 called Graham-Rudman-Hollings. And those are the three gentlemen you see at the bottom of your screen. Graham on the left was a Republican. Rudman in the center was an independent, former Republican that became independent. And then Fritz Hollings on the right was a Democrat. Democrat from South Carolina, which you don't see all that often anymore. But it was a bipartisan piece of legislation that said, let's eliminate deficits by creating a timetable. And in each year, what we will do is we will set up a maximum allowable deficit target. If we don't meet that maximum allowable deficit target in that year, then we'll engage in a process known as sequestration, where we'll do across the board budget cuts across all areas until we can get our budget down to that target. It was meant to be such a politically repugnant process that Congress would do everything in its power to avoid sequestration and come in alignment with that deficit target each year. Problem was, each and every year, we exceeded that deficit target. Congress could then go and just increase the deficit target and start over again. And that's what it did every year. We missed it this year, we then increase it and start over again, increase all of our deficit targets in our timetable, and every year they would do that. When Congress can simply change the rules are never going to work. So Graham, Rubin, and Hollings and its follow-up, Graham, Rubin, and Hollings 2 years later, were completely ineffective at eliminating deficits. We continued to run deficits, and deficits kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger with each subsequent year. So finally, in the early 1990s, we had this thing called the Budget Enforcement Act. And the purpose of the Budget Enforcement Act was to, instead of focusing on deficits, let's focus on runaway spending. And so what it did is it created 3 categories of spending: domestic, defense, and international. And it created firewalls between those categories. So if you wanted to increase spending on domestic programs, you could not rob from defense to pay for domestic or vice versa. It also then created this thing known as PAYGO, which stood for pay as you go. So if you wanted to create a new program, you would have to find a way to pay for that program. You couldn't borrow money to pay for that program. You would have to pay for that program by reducing spending on another program within that same category. So it was intended to try and impose fiscal discipline on Congress. Subsequent to this act, throughout the 1990s, we then had this very quickly growing economy. We had the dot-com boom in the Silicon Valley. We had all these internet companies that were making money hand over foot, which meant that a lot of that money was then coming in terms of federal income taxation. So we had a great increase in the amount of revenue the federal government had, and we had a decrease in spending because of these limitations placed on Congress by the Budget Enforcement Act. And it's not rocket science, but when you have more revenue coming in and you have less expenditures, it allows you to reduce your deficit, so much so that in the fiscal years of 99 and 2000, we were actually in surplus spending. Then the terrorist attack of September 11th happened in 2001. The subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had this exponential increase in military spending, and then we started running deficits again. And since then, every year we have run deficits, and deficits tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Deficits are obviously problematic because it means your budgeting process is not only out of control, but all those accumulated deficits will then all contribute to your overall national debt. The moral of the story here is that eliminating deficits and controlling the budget process is much more a matter of political will than it is a matter of procedural changes. And until you have members of Congress who have the political will to either increase revenue through tax and fee increases and or decrease expenditures, you're never going to be able to get control of the federal budgeting process. And this has all become exacerbated with partisan gerrymandering and the creation of these safe districts. So now you have safe Republican and you have safe Democratic districts, which means that Republicans have to appeal to conservatives, Democrats to get reelected have to appeal to liberals, progressives, and you have seen the Republican Democratic Party kind of move to their ideological corners. That has hollowed out the middle ground where negotiation and compromise used to occur. So it has become ever more difficult with each passing year to get the budget done on time and to bring the budget in on balance. At the state level, we are now suffering from the loss of all that federal COVID money. So all those COVID grants have now expired, they have gone away, and now we are really starting to experience the true impact of the COVID pandemic. We didn't see it so much in 2001 and 2002 because we had all that relief money. Now that that relief money is gone, we're seeing that hole get blown in the state budget, and we're really starting to pay the price for the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why, unfortunately, the picture on the screen is the poor gentleman with his pockets turned out empty. I think that we're going to continue to see more fiscal stress in the future as we get farther and farther away from COVID. Hopefully, we're going to see less of that stress, but we're really starting to see those impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's our discussion of the management of financial resources. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you tonight. I apologize for that, but I wanted to make sure that we got through all of our information that will help you complete the final assessment and also prepare you well for success in 577 and 555. So that's all the information we typically cover here in PPA 500. In our last couple of minutes that we have left together, do you have any questions, needs for clarification, anything at all before we wrap things up? Remember, this is being recorded, and so if you need a refresher on any of this information, I will have the recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning, and you can then watch the recording. In completing that final assessment, you now have all the information you need for all 5 of those scenarios. Use these recordings, use the information from the textbook. You can use any information at your disposal in order to do those scenarios. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. So then this is our last class?
Yes, this is our last Zoom session, so we will not have a Zoom session next Wednesday. All you'll be doing for next Wednesday is just finishing up your final assessment and turning that final assessment in by midnight.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. It's been a joy working with you. I know we cover a lot of information and we cover it very, very quickly, but hopefully this class has set you up for success as you go on and take your future required and elective courses. Even if the class is over, I hope to see you in future courses. And if you have any questions or need anything from me after the class is over, as close as my email, so feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help you out in any way I can. So have a great remainder of your fall semester and take care. Have a great rest of your week, and hopefully I'll see you in the future. So take care, everyone.
Thank you for a great class.
Thank you. Likewise.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.